Welcome to Lesson 2, and Lesson 2 we're going to keep going on with the nervous system, specifically the central nervous system. So we're going to be talking about the brain and the spinal cord in these videos. So first let's kind of talk about how the central nervous system develops. So when you're first developing in the womb, you create what's called a neural tube, and it really is a tube, and that's the start of the central nervous system. By the 4th week, you can already start to see the brain beginning to develop, and it's starting to grow into certain chambers called ventricles. So if we look here, this is really a fascinating picture. So at 3 weeks, we really start to see this neural tube forming. And then by 4 weeks, we can already start to kind of map out the different parts of the brain. And obviously they're different names as they're developing. But already look at 3 months in the womb. It's incredible how much that brain is already prevalent in development. So the brain is commonly going to be discussed in 4 major regions, and this is how we're going to kind of go through the brain. So one being the cerebral hemispheres. So that's kind of the part of the brain that we're all really familiar with, that's got all those folds and everything. And then more internal to those cerebral hemispheres are going to be the diencephalon. We also have the brain stem, and then the cerebellum on the posterior aspect. So first we're going to get into the cerebral hemispheres. So the cerebrum is composed of the 2 cerebral hemispheres. It's much larger than the other 3 regions of the brain. And you're going to notice on the brain that you're going to have those elevated ridges. Those are going to be called the gyri or gyri, depending on your professor. Sulci are going to be the little shallow grooves of the brain. And then you're also going to have very deep fissures that separate the larger regions of the brain. And the brain is going to be divided into lobes. Each lobe, this is the really nice part of this, each lobe of the brain is actually going to be named for the cranial bone that lies over them. So if you remember your cranial bones from the skeletal system, this is going to be super easy for you to remember. So these are the different lobes that we're going to be talking about. You have your parietal lobe, your frontal lobe, your temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. So each cerebral hemisphere is going to consist of 3 basic regions. The most superficial portion of your cerebral hemispheres is going to be the cortex, and that's that gray tissue that we're really familiar with what the brain looks like. More deep to that cortex is going to be white matter, and then within that white matter you're going to have what's called basal nuclei, which are going to be islands of gray matter. And if you remember from us talking in lesson 1, the major difference between gray and white matter is myelination. So gray tissue is going to be unmyelinated, and white tissue is going to have that myelination to it. So here's kind of a cross-section of the brain, and you can see right here is going to be the cortex, that superficial gray tissue. And one of my favorite things about looking at real pictures of the brain or doing brain dissections, you really can easily see that difference between the white and the gray matter. The cortex is really easy to kind of follow around. Then you see the white matter that's deep to it, so this would be all your white matter. And then this would be a really good example of a basal nuclei because it's an island of gray matter that's surrounded by that white matter. So the cerebral cortex, or that gray matter, is really what makes us us. This is the part of the brain that controls a lot of your logic, your thinking, your memory, your ability to analyze information, consciousness, interpretation of sensation, even your voluntary muscle movement is all controlled by certain aspects of this cerebral cortex. And we're going to get into all the different locations of various structures within this cerebral cortex that does all of these certain things. So first we're going to talk about the primary somatic sensory area. This is going to be on the parietal lobe. And this is going to recognize sensation. Okay, it's called the sensory area. So this is where sensation is going to be interpreted, like pain, coldness, and touch. Excuse me. And what I find super, super, super cool about this is science has come such a far way, neurology has come such a far way. We are able to map out your primary somatic sensory area. So I want you to look at the blue over here. This is mapping out your sensory cortex, and we call this the sensory homunculus. We really honestly can analyze which part of this sensory cortex is looking at different body parts. So for example, you are really hot, so you go to the fridge and you pull out an ice cube and you put the ice cube in your mouth. This area here where you see tongue, teeth, jaws, lips, that is going to be where that sensation is sent to. So we've literally been able to map out the very specific part where that cold on the tongue is being interpreted. All right, then we have the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is going to be in the back, and that's your visual center of the brain. You actually have, your eyes are going to be up here, somewhere in this area. And you actually have a major optic nerve that travels all the way to the back of the occipital lobe. Then you have your temporal lobe, which lies over the temporal bone. This is going to be your hearing center, okay? And it's easy to remember because it's located where your ears are. Then we have our primary motor cortex. This is going to be where we interpret, or not really interpret, but decide what to do with our skeletal muscles. So it's located on the frontal lobe. It's right in front of the sensory cortex. And we have a lot of major motor tracts here, specifically the corticospinal tract that goes all the way down the spinal cord, so you're able to coordinate all of those skeletal muscle movements. So just like our sensory cortex, our motor cortex has that homunculus. And what it said on the last slide was a majority of it is going to be dedicated to face and hands. And you can see that it definitely is. And the reason for this is it takes a lot more coordination to be able to do fine motor movements. So me even talking right now is a fine motor movement. I'm coordinating my lips and my tongue to be moving a very certain way to get the correct words out. And if you notice over here, this is all of your trunk and your legs. Okay, when you're running, that's a gross motor movement. It doesn't actually take a lot of thought or it doesn't take a lot of thinking to be able to run. Once you kind of just start running, it's kind of automatic. You just do it. So that's why not a lot of your sensory or your motor homunculus is dedicated to that. All right, then we have Broca's area. Broca's area is a really specialized area that helps us with speaking. This is an area where if you damage it, it's going to be really hard to say what you want to say. You know what you want to say, but it's really difficult to be able to get the words that you want to say out. So if someone has like a stroke and damages this area, they're able to interpret speech. They're able to understand what someone is saying to them. They just can't get the words out that they want to provoke back to them. And then we have the speech area. This is the actual interpretation of speech. So when someone is talking to you, this is the ability to hear it and understand what is being said. Okay, so if we look here, here is that Broca's area. It's located here. And then really your speech area would be kind of located in this area here. And one more thing on this picture I want you to look at. This is your motor cortex and the sensory cortex. They literally make a headband kind of around the frontal lobe, and then the sensory cortex makes a headband around the parietal lobe. All right, next we're going to go deeper and we're going to talk about the white matter. So now we're going below the cerebral cortex. And remember, if it's white matter, it's going to be myelinated, and that's for speed. So your cerebral cortex is all gray because this is where your interpretation is happening. This is where your thought and your logic and your memory is all happening. So we don't need it to necessarily send fast impulses because we're actually analyzing stuff. But then when we want to send out information or receive information, we want to have that white matter below it because it's really fast. And then we're able to send information to and from the cerebral cortex extremely quickly. And a huge, huge, huge fiber tract is called the corpus callosum. And this is really important because it literally allows your right and left cerebral hemisphere to communicate. And this is really important because sometimes you only have certain areas on one side of the brain. For example, your Broca's area and your speech area only lie on one hemisphere. So if we look here, the purple tracts are going to be the corpus callosum. Or right here, I'm sorry, the green. The green tracts here are going to be the corpus callosum. And what they're doing is they're connecting the right and the left cerebral hemispheres together. So your right and left cerebral hemispheres are able to communicate. Then we have our association fiber tracts, which connect areas within a hemisphere. So these are going to be able to connect all the right side of your structures together. Then your projection fiber tracts are going to take information from the cerebral cortex and bring it down to the diencephalon or the brainstem. So going back again, here's our green corpus callosum connecting the right and left cerebral hemispheres. The purple are going to be your projection fiber tracts. So you can see they're bringing information from the cerebral cortex down to the diencephalon and the brainstem. And then these pink tracts here are going to be the association tracts, which are just connecting areas within the right cerebral hemispheres or the left cerebral hemispheres. Okay, last are basal nuclei, are islands of gray matter. So these are going to be basically kind of like a fine motor tuning. It's interesting to think about, but once we send information down from the motor cortex, it kind of stops here and modifies those instructions. So if you're running and you need to do like a sudden stop, this is going to be the part of the brain that helps you be able to do that. Okay, and if you look here, I just wanted to point out that these pink islands are going to be your basal nuclei, deep within that white matter. All right, so we're going to stop here. We just went through our first big structure, or our cerebral hemispheres, and then talked about a lot of different structures within them. We're going to stop, and then we're going to continue on with the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum in the next video.